My name is Abhay Dandekar, and I share conversations with talented and interesting individuals linked to the global Indian and South Asian community. It's informal and informative, adding insights to our evolving cultural expressions, where each person can proudly say, "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." So periodically on Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing, we share a spotlight conversation and feature brief chats with an individual from the community about a special topic or a unique endeavor. It's hopefully obvious to many that the AI revolution has not only begun, but it's in full swing. Now, since I'm in healthcare and a wee bit older than those entering the workforce right now, I wanted to get the perspective of someone who's not only grown up with AI as a digital tool and a familiar science, but also someone who's developed a relationship in researching AI and using it to tackle problems at scale. So it was wonderful to connect and share a brief chat with machine learning technology researcher and entrepreneur Dhruv Kulkarni. Dhruv is both a current college student at Berkeley, go Bears by the way, and a tech startup founder, someone who grew comfortable with machine learning and AI early on in his formative years. It's that same comfort and ease that fueled a spirit of innovation and utility to use these tools and help solve problems, particularly of interest for me in the healthcare space, where so far Dhruv has tackled the administrative problem of accelerating prior authorizations in small clinics, and now is serving as AI director at Forta Health and helping to tackle chronic conditions and problems like helping parents in caring for autistic children. Now, if you're keeping score at home, Dhruv has already along the way served as an entrepreneurial peer resource and mentor for other students, founded 2 startup companies that were acquired, developed an emerging expertise at the intersection of fintech and AI, and has already gained investor experience as a venture partner. We chatted, and I wanted to learn a bit more about his work and journey, but we started by talking about when Dhruv first discovered that AI and machine learning was something he could harness and actually control.
That's a really interesting question. I think the story goes back to around like 9th grade when I started just getting into AI, machine learning, coding, programming. And the way it all started out was when I was teaching myself the basics of this technology. I was following a tutorial on a guide called TensorFlow. It's Google's library for AI. And I was trying out some of their toolkits. And one of their projects is to use a convolutional neural network, which is a form of AI that analyzes images to try to understand what digit was written in an image. So, for example, I could feed it the image of number 9, and it would say this is a 9.
Yeah.
And so when I built that system myself, basically following the tutorial, I realized this is a pretty ridiculous amount of technology. It really is intelligent. I'm seeing it understand these images that I'm feeding it, and it's able to comprehend them, and I can train it and change it in ways that I want to. And, the opportunity and the ways that my imagination took me were just limitless. I was like, wow, there's so much potential in this. So I think that's where it all got started.
When I think about like something that you can like feed and you can grow and you can train, I'm like thinking of like, okay, well that sounds like a pet, in a way. Was the relationship kind of the same there? Because like in the example you're talking about, you could basically present the program an image of a sweater, and that's not a 9. But then when you realize that it learns that it's not a 9, that's kind of a quick aha moment. And did it just basically blossom for there? Did it feel like it was sort of training a pet in a way?
That's a really good analogy. And I think that, what I think is funny about AI is in many ways, it's much easier than training a pet because you can understand exactly why things are happening, how to, get the outcome that we're looking for. For example, with the sweater analogy, I could add sweater as something that I could recognize and just say like, hey, I feed it this is a banana, this is a sweater, image classification. So from my perspective, I just figured, wow, this is so much more rigorous and structured than it is to, let's say, teach a pet or teach a human being how something works. And I just loved that, iteration process because it meant that I could more directly take something and apply it to the real world.
When you mentioned that it's like rigorous and structured, did that take a lot of practice for you to then start defining what the rigor means and what the structure is all about? Like, fast forward to say, now you're in 10th grade and you're thinking like, okay, well, I got beyond the basics. How did you become a little bit more aware of saying, hey, now I can actually change the design and make things a little bit more complicated so that you can problem solve?
I think a lot of it comes from first principles thinking and from understanding math. Just at the core, the AI system, I treat it like a block. There's inputs, there's outputs.
Yeah.
And then maybe I can change some of these inputs to try to change some of these outputs. And I didn't try to overcomplicate it in the beginning. Like, oh, maybe there's a ton of other factors in here.
Yeah.
There's lots of weights and biases. But if I just treat it as one black box, and I try not to overcomplicate the insides of the black box, I can try to edit stuff that's going on outside, like these inputs and outputs. So thinking about it that way, just from a first principles approach, where changing some things could change other things, just gave me that mindset to more quickly make improvements on the systems and change them in ways that I wanted to.
I mean, in a way, all of this is really gearing to problem solve and find solutions for things, whether they're personal, whether they're systemic, whether they're structural. And in a way, I wonder if the most pressing solutions are ones that are based on basic components of empathy, right? Like, I need to understand what your problem is in order for me to help solve that. And that probably exists on many, many different levels. But when you think about that, what value have you found for having a sense of human empathy in an incredibly digitally driven mathematical space where emotion and empathy are not always the first words that come to mind when you're thinking about AI and machine learning in this way?
Yeah, I definitely think that empathy has been one of the biggest drivers of not only my success, but for most people, their success when it comes to the corporate environment and the startup landscape. And not to make this like a super corporate answer, but
yeah,
I think customer empathy is super important when it comes to building a startup. I think it's important because if you have empathy for the people you're working with, the people you're serving, then you can better understand their needs and better fulfill them. So that's an amazing thing. Also, just when it comes to healthcare, if you don't have empathy, then I think you're in the wrong place. That's just my answer there.
Sort of wrong right there, right?
Yeah.
And yet, when you think about like sort of the corporate environment, you're building a product, you want to get like really close to what the customer or even the source, where the source of the problem is. In the beginning, when you were first starting out with this, I mean, did you find that being able to empathize with the person who is dealing with this problem, or even the problem itself, was helpful to get to, in a way, for both the machine and for you to get better at what you do?
Oh, 100%. I actually wrote a LinkedIn post about this the other day.
Yeah.
One of the main ways in which people start out on these startup journeys is with a ton of customer interviews.
Yeah.
Which means they go out there and they interview a bunch of folks who they think they can serve. For example, for me, I went out there and I interviewed a ton of clinics, small clinics and practices serving Medicaid. And I learned about their problems, what they like doing, what they don't like doing, what they dream about working on, what they hate working on, and so on and so forth. And just better understanding their problems allowed me to better build systems to serve them. So that was the perspective I brought to this. And I think most people start out on their journeys with these kind of interviews. So I think that empathy and being a good listener is at the core of a lot of these, journeys.
That's totally opposite from saying, hey, I have this cool idea and whoever wants to can come and, gravitate towards this, as opposed to, hey, let me figure out what your problem is and then find a good idea that's going to actually match that.
Absolutely.
And in this way, like, especially as you go through now, either, with a startup or learning about this even more, do you find that, it also allows you to get curious and discover about the things that you really don't know, right? Because you reach sort of this asymptotic plateau of like, hey, I'm finally solving a problem. And yet you have to constantly have vision about the next problem that's there, or like the space that's still going to be occupied by your learning.
Oh, 100%. I have recently actually started as an investor.
Yeah.
And I think that part of that journey is just understanding lots of different problems and markets and spaces. The same thing is true for a founder, but just to a much deeper and more specific degree about one problem. So, for example, for me, when I want to learn about, let's say, what's going on in manufacturing, even if it's just curiosity, then now I understand the approaches to read a bunch of materials, to go talk to a bunch of people, try to maybe solve some of their problems, to understand them better. And then after that, I have a more refined understanding of what the problems are.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that refinement is really sort of like the key, and that that's a cycle that just keeps reiterating itself. When people learn about you and they meet you and they think about the work that you're doing, especially given, all the things that you've accomplished and all the things that you want to accomplish, what do you think surprises people when they first are learning about you and your work?
I think that most people, when they meet me, assume that I'm mostly a technologist and a researcher.
Yeah.
And I think that since I've started out as a technologist and researcher, that's not, too incorrect of an assumption.
Right.
But since then I've broadened out a lot of my horizons. For example, recently I've been working on the political side. I've been working on the investment side.
Yeah.
I've been branching out into lots of different projects. So, people are sometimes surprised by, number one, the number of projects I'm working on.
Yeah.
Number two, the breadth and the scope of these projects.
Yeah. And is that something that you think is an unfair assumption that people make, that like you're a vertical person and that you don't have sort of horizontal tentacles from that vertical expertise?
I think it's I think it's a function of how society tries to put people in boxes, because it's easier to draw an assumption and then run with that assumption, even if it's slightly wrong.
How do you respond when people are surprised by that? Like, I mean, does that also fuel kind of your capacity or your motivation to become even more diverse in your thinking?
I think so.
Yeah,
that's a funny question. I think that a lot of folks, whenever they make an incorrect assumption about me, then I like to offer, a more complete perspective.
Yeah. Healthcare is a space that you've now spent some time, but not just learning about and gathering data, but also customizing and, making models and creating those models and then deploying them. And what do you think now, having that perspective of interviewing and learning deeply about what are some of the pain points and what are some of the successes in healthcare? What do you think healthcare as a general space has to unlearn about machine learning and AI to find success? Like, we in healthcare make a lot of assumptions about what AI is and what AI does. What do you think that, healthcare in general as an entity needs to unwind and unlearn about it, all this, in order to really start zooming with it?
I love that question.
Yeah.
I think one of the main things that people assume incorrectly about AI is that it can't be HIPAA compliant. And people think that AI is going to take people's data and leak it to the world, and that PHI will be a thing of the past, and that any form of AI will just break every regulation out there. The truth is that it's actually very straightforward to make even an open AI model HIPAA compliant. It's just following certain procedures is an important thing. So I think that while these fears about data privacy, they're totally understandable, I think that they can be mitigated just by taking the right measures and steps. Another one, I think, and this is less about unlearning, but more about applications. There's a lot of places in which people would be surprised that AI can make an impact, but it can completely transform an industry. For example, in clinical trial matching, it's a big deal. It's a big deal in a lot of the back office paperwork. For example, you mentioned prior auths. There's insurance, billing, payments, stuff for after the procedure as well. Things on the front office side like billing, booking, scheduling, scheduling, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And it's just such a massive amount of opportunity. I think people are being constrained by how they think AI can help instead of how it can really help.
We were speaking in Marathi a little bit ago, and just even the capacity to serve for patient understanding in their language, and understand like how to translate health literacy better for patients in a language that they understand. Those are just the two things that I came up with off the top of my head. But we would want to design systems that are appropriately compliant and they meet regulatory standards, but also at the same time they're protecting both patients and providers to sort of excel. I mean, one final thought about a lot of this is we think about AI and machine learning and the exponential velocity that this is growing at right now. How do you think AI, in a way, should help strengthen human connections? And I hope that makes sense. How do you hope that human relationship development will change, or that people can actually develop stronger bonds with each other by leveraging technology or harmonizing with the technology?
Yeah. So I think there's a few different areas. One is in connection. I think that right now there's a lot of time that people spend on connecting. For example, there's platforms out there like Airbnb and Uber that make this easier. Like, I want to go to a destination, I want to book a place, and I want to spend some time there. Airbnb makes this a lot easier.
Yeah.
But now I can imagine this being so much more powerful across everything. For example, finding the right teacher. Instead of spending a ton of time doing this, I can have my experience working with my current teacher enhanced by working with AI. Same goes for doctors, same goes for lawyers, most services-based industries. That's huge. And then on the side of the future of work, I think it's also going to be a tremendous opportunity because people who are working in jobs that are, even in places where they're very happy, spend even some small amount of time on stuff they don't care about.
Yeah.
For example, as a programmer, I would spend a lot of time implementing, let's say, auth, which is just making sure logins work correctly. And nobody's really passionate about making a login page, right?
Some people are, I guess.
Yeah. And even at that point, every profession has some parts that some people might not enjoy. And making it so that AI can fill those gaps and make it so that people can focus more on what they really care about instead of on stuff that is less meaningful to them can just, I think, in general, improve people's levels of happiness, contentment, productivity, and so on.
What brings you the most optimism and in a way kind of like positivity when it comes to AI? I mean, there's a lot of barriers at every step, and there's a lot of things that you learn about training AI and training the models and designing the models. And then as a founder, as someone who's an investor, there's of course the people relationships that you have to cultivate with all stakeholders. But what do you find most optimistic about this work? Like, how does this motivate you even further on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I think the most optimistic thing that I'm seeing out there is just how everybody's so aligned in figuring out what can be impactful. Every researcher I talk to is thinking not only about how AI can get better, but about how we can better use AI to impact people. Same thing goes for founders. Every founder I talk to, many of them are concerning themselves with questions like, is this the best thing I can do right now, or is there something that I can do to better serve the world? Yeah. Whether it's in healthcare, manufacturing, or something else. Yeah. And outside of that, investors are focused on enabling these solutions to better serve the world. People on Capitol Hill are focused on constraining the harmful uses of AI and also enabling the better use of AI, better innovation cycles and so on and so forth. So I think that what I'm very optimistic about is just how laser focused everybody is on using AI to better empower the world.
Do you think that this kind of constant push and pull between regulating and innovating at some point is going to, meet in the middle and then just allow for this to really blossom and explode? Or is it just going to always be this like, well, no, we really have to regulate so that it can't, become so big or monopolize or be unsafe? And, how do you navigate that sort of creative tension, which is going to be there in almost any industry, but definitely at the forefront when in technology and especially with AI right now?
I think it's really important to have an open stream of communication. And actually, it's funny. So I recently started a nonprofit think tank. So I was in DC just last week. And the goal was to educate policymakers about what AI actually is. Because I think many of them have expressed a desire to learn more about AI, to meet some of these practitioners, researchers, and so on. And so what we're doing is we're connecting top researchers, AI experts, and these folks to people on Capitol Hill, hosting them at events, expositions, conferences, and so on. And finally, creating content, capturing the voices of American people who are benefiting from AI so that people can understand both sides, not just the fear and uncertainty, but also how AI is really impacting people. For example, we interviewed somebody who is a trucker. He uses Google Maps every day. And Google Maps is a very clear use of AI and just radically changes that industry. So I think that, from a policy perspective, my perspective is that people in Silicon Valley need to better understand how policy will affect them. And people on Capitol Hill need to better understand how technology here is being developed, how it's being applied, and how it can potentially harm other people.
Well, whether it's socializing and educating or designing the next system or making sure that the world and universe of AI is being used for good. Dhruv, it's been a terrific pleasure to chat and meet with you, and hopefully we can share this conversation further down the line.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Dhruv, and take a look at some of the links in the show notes online. Again, if you have a chance and have been enjoying these, please take a moment to offer a kind rating or review wherever you might be listening or watching. Till next time, I'm Abhay Dandekar.